The morning sun rose over Tula Prime like a pale orange disk through the thick atmosphere. Commander Vincent Hayes stood at the observation deck of the main colony building and watched the wetlands stretch endlessly toward the horizon. His wife Margaret was already awake and preparing for another journey into Modoc territory. She moved through their quarters with practiced efficiency and gathered her research equipment into worn leather bags. Vincent knew better than to ask her to stay home today. Margaret had devoted 3 years of her life to studying the Modoc people, and nothing would stop her from continuing that work. The Modoc were unlike any species humanity had encountered before. They stood taller than most humans and possessed strength that seemed impossible for their lean frames. Their skin carried patterns that shifted colors with their emotions, and their eyes saw deeper into the infrared spectrum than human technology could match. Most colonists feared them or dismissed them as primitive savages who lived in mud huts and hunted with spears. Margaret knew better. She had learned their language and eaten at their fires and understood that the Modoc possessed wisdom that human civilization had forgotten centuries ago. Winema arrived at the research outpost just as the sun cleared the tree line. She moved through the forest without making a sound, and her footsteps left barely any trace on the soft ground. The young Modoc warrior had become Margaret's closest friend over the past year. She wore traditional hunting leathers decorated with symbols that told the story of her family lineage. Her spear was strapped across her back and her knife hung at her hip. Despite the weapons, she carried an air of gentleness that put Margaret at ease. Margaret greeted Winema in the Modoc language, and the warrior's face brightened with pleasure. Few humans bothered to learn even basic phrases, and Winema appreciated the effort more than words could express. They sat together on the porch of the outpost and shared breakfast while discussing the day's plans. Margaret wanted to document the seasonal migration patterns of the marsh creatures that the Modoc hunted. Winema had agreed to guide her to the best observation points deep in the wetlands. Daniel Cooper watched the two women from inside the outpost lab. He had served as Margaret's research assistant for 8 months and had developed tremendous respect for her dedication. Daniel was young and idealistic, and believed that humanity's future among the stars depended on building genuine relationships with alien species. He saw in Margaret a role model for what human explorers should be. His admiration had grown into something deeper over recent weeks, though he knew Margaret was happily married and completely focused on her work. The peace of the morning shattered when a transport shuttle landed near the colony headquarters. Ambassador Kellen Voss emerged from the craft, followed by his security chief, Captain Gregory Stone. Voss was a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they observed. Stone was built like a military tank and carried himself with the rigid discipline of a career soldier. They had arrived from the Galactic Council with a mandate to negotiate mining rights on Tula Prime. Commander Hayes met them in the council chamber along with several senior colonists. Voss wasted no time with pleasantries. He spread holographic maps across the table that showed vast deposits of stellarium ore beneath Modoc lands. The ore was essential for faster-than-light travel, and the council wanted it extracted immediately. Hayes pointed out that the land belonged to the Modoc, and any mining would require their consent. Voss smiled without warmth and suggested that primitive species rarely understood what was best for galactic progress. Patrick Kelly spoke up from his seat near the back of the room. He ran the colony's construction crews and had grown frustrated with restrictions that protected Modoc territory. Kelly was a rough man who believed in taking what you needed and apologizing later if necessary. He argued that the Modoc had no concept of property rights and would never miss a few square kilometers of swampland. Several other colonists nodded in agreement. Hayes felt the mood in the room shift toward something dangerous. Margaret returned to the colony that evening and learned about the council's arrival. She immediately requested a meeting with Ambassador Voss. He received her in his temporary office with barely concealed contempt. Voss had read her reports and considered her an obstacle to progress. Margaret explained that the Modoc had complex social structures and deeply spiritual connections to their land. Removing them or taking their territory without consent would be morally wrong and practically disastrous. Voss assured her that the council had no intention of removing anyone, and simply wanted fair compensation for mining rights. Margaret did not believe him but had no proof of ulterior motives. Winema brought troubling news the next day. Modoc scouts had observed human survey teams marking territories far beyond the agreed boundaries. Chief Kintpuash had called a council of elders to discuss the situation. Many younger warriors wanted to drive the humans off their lands immediately. Kintpuash was old and wise and remembered when the first humans arrived. He had chosen peace then and maintained it through years of small tensions. Now he wondered if that choice had been a mistake. Margaret convinced Commander Hayes to arrange a formal summit between the colony leadership and the Modoc chiefs. Hayes agreed despite Ambassador Vross's objections. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at a neutral location between the colony and the main Modoc settlement. Captain Stone insisted on bringing armed security forces. Margaret argued that weapons would send the wrong message but was overruled. Daniel would accompany her as translator, even though Margaret's language skills had surpassed his months ago. He suspected she wanted him there for moral support more than linguistic assistance. The days before the summit were tense. Patrick Kelly's crews continued their surveys, and several confrontations occurred when they encountered Modoc hunting parties. No violence erupted, but both sides came close. Margaret spent long hours with Winema preparing arguments for peace. The Modoc warrior was torn between loyalty to her people and her friendship with Margaret. She had come to believe that not all humans were threats, but convincing her father and the other chiefs would be difficult. Ambassador Vross held private meetings with Captain Stone and Patrick Kelly. They spoke in careful terms about opportunities and necessary actions. Stone selected a special squad led by Lieutenant Karen Price for security duty. Price was young and ambitious and followed orders without asking uncomfortable questions. Vross emphasized that the galaxy needed the Stellarium ore, and that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. Kelly understood what was being implied and nodded his agreement. They were planning something that Commander Hayes would never approve, which was why Hayes would not be informed until it was too late. The summit took place in a clearing where ancient trees formed a natural cathedral. Modoc chiefs arrived first and arranged themselves in a semicircle according to their clan rankings. Chief Kintpuash sat in the center position with Winema standing behind him as honor guard. The other chiefs brought their own warriors, and the display of Modoc strength was impressive. Each warrior carried weapons that had been passed down through generations, and their bearing showed years of training in combat arts that humans barely understood. Commander Hayes arrived with Ambassador Vross and a delegation of colonists. Captain Stone deployed his security team around the perimeter with weapons clearly visible. Margaret noticed the Modoc warriors tense at the display and whispered urgently to Hayes that the guns were a mistake. Hayes ordered Stone to have his people lower their weapons, but the damage was done. The Modoc chiefs exchanged glances that spoke of old prophecies about sky demons who came with thundersticks to steal the land. Margaret stepped forward with Daniel at her side and greeted the chiefs in formal Modoc protocol. She had learned the proper phrases and gestures during months of patient study. Chief Kintpuash acknowledged her with a slight nod that conveyed more respect than any human realized. Winema's eyes met Margaret's, and a silent understanding passed between them. They had spent countless hours together and had formed a bond that transcended the differences between their species. Margaret trusted Winema with her life, and Winema felt the same way about her human friend. Ambassador Vross opened the negotiations by explaining the Galactic Council's position. He spoke about progress and mutual benefit and the opportunities that stellarium mining would bring to both humans and Modoc. His words were smooth and practiced and completely hollow. Chief Kintpuash listened without expression, while Vross talked about providing medicine and technology in exchange for mining access. When the ambassador finished, the old chief was silent for a long moment, before responding in careful human speech that he had learned years ago. Kintpuash spoke about the land and its meaning to his people. Every hill and stream had names that connected to Modoc history. The places where Vross wanted to mine were sacred sites where ancestors were buried, and where young Modoc went to seek visions that would guide their lives. Taking those lands would be like cutting out the heart of Modoc culture. The chief's words were simple but carried weight that made even Vross pause. Margaret translated some of the deeper cultural references that Daniel missed, and Hayes began to understand the true cost of what the council was demanding. Patrick Kelly interrupted with impatience. He argued that the Modoc could relocate their sacred sites or find new ones. Land was just land, and sentimentality should not stand in the way of galactic needs. Several chiefs rose to their feet with hands on weapons. Winema's spear was in her hands before anyone saw her move. The clearing erupted into chaos as both sides prepared for violence. Margaret stepped into the space between the groups and raised her voice above the commotion. She spoke in Modoc and told the chiefs that not all humans were like Kelly. She spoke in human language and told the colonists that the Modoc had every right to defend their homes. Her voice carried a passion that surprised everyone, including herself. Margaret had always been a scientist who observed and recorded, but now she was something more. She was a bridge between two species who desperately needed to understand each other. Daniel watched her with growing admiration and realized that his feelings had become something he could no longer ignore. Winema moved to Margaret's side and added her voice to the plea for peace. She spoke of the time she had spent with Margaret and the things she had learned about humans. Not all of them were greedy or violent. Some, like Margaret, genuinely wanted to know the Modoc as people rather than obstacles. Winema's father listened to his daughter with surprise. She had always been strong and brave, but now she was showing wisdom beyond her years. The young warrior was arguing for peace not from weakness but from a position of genuine friendship with a human. The tension slowly eased and both sides sat down again. Captain Stone looked disappointed as he ordered his security team to stand down. Ambassador Vross concealed his irritation behind a diplomatic smile. Commander Hayes felt relief wash over him and gratitude toward his wife for preventing disaster. Chief Kinpuash proposed a compromise. The Modoc would allow limited mining in areas that held less spiritual significance in exchange for medicine and tools, and a promise that humans would respect marked boundaries. It was not everything Vross wanted, but it was more than the Modoc had ever offered before. The agreement was sealed with a formal ceremony that combined human and Modoc traditions. Margaret and Winema stood together as witnesses and symbols of the friendship that made the treaty possible. When the ceremony concluded, Winema removed a pendant from around her neck and placed it over Margaret's head. The pendant was a smooth stone, carved with symbols that represented the Modoc concept of eternal bonds. Only Modoc women could wear such pendants, and giving one to an outsider was unprecedented. The gesture spoke of trust and affection that went deeper than words could express. Margaret accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. She understood the cultural weight of what Winema had done. Daniel watched the exchange with conflicting emotions. He was happy for Margaret's achievement, but also aware that he was seeing something profound that he could never be part of. His feelings for Margaret had grown into love, but her heart belonged to her work and her husband, and now to her friendship with Winema. Daniel knew he needed to accept his role as observer and assistant, rather than hoping for something more. The colonists celebrated the treaty that evening with food and music. Margaret stayed only briefly before returning to the outpost with her research notes. Vincent found her later working by lamplight and sat beside her without speaking. He had watched her transformation over the past years and felt proud of what she had accomplished. Vincent loved Margaret for her brilliant mind and her compassionate heart. He also understood that she belonged to something larger than their marriage. She was building bridges between worlds, and he would support that work even when it took her away from him. Winema returned to her people and reported on the summit to the gathered clans. Most Modoc were suspicious of the treaty and worried that humans would eventually demand more. Winema defended Margaret fiercely and argued that the human scientist had proven her worth through years of respectful study. Not everyone was convinced, but Winema's status as a warrior gave her words weight. Her father watched her with knowing eyes. Kinpuash recognized that his daughter had formed a bond with the human woman that might prove either salvation or doom for their people. Only time would reveal which path the friendship would lead them down. Ambassador Vross met with Captain Stone in private after the celebration ended. The treaty was a setback, but not a defeat. Vross had not risen to his position in the Galactic Council by accepting limitations. He spoke carefully about opportunities that might arise if the Modoc were to violate the treaty first. Stone understood what was being implied and began making plans. Lieutenant Karen Price was summoned and given special instructions. She would select a team of reliable soldiers who understood that sometimes orders came that were not officially recorded. The conspiracy was taking shape in whispers and coded language that left no evidence trail. Ambassador Vross spent his days reviewing survey reports and his nights planning how to overcome the treaty limitations. The stellarium deposits beneath Modoc lands were worth billions, and the Galactic Council expected results. Vross had built his career on delivering what others thought impossible, and he would not let primitive aliens stand in his way. He studied the treaty language looking for loopholes and technicalities, but Chief Kinposh had been surprisingly shrewd in the negotiations. The agreement was simple and clear, and allowed no room for creative interpretation. Captain Stone suggested a more direct approach during one of their private meetings. If the Modoc could be provoked into breaking the treaty, then human forces would be justified in responding with overwhelming force. Once fighting started, the Council could declare the treaty void and seize whatever territory they deemed necessary for security. Frost recognized the crude effectiveness of the plan. The challenge would be provoking the Modoc without leaving evidence that humans had initiated the conflict. Stone assured him that such operations were well within his capabilities. Patrick Kelly joined their conspiracy without much persuasion. He had grown wealthy running construction projects on colony worlds and saw Tula Prime as his biggest opportunity yet. The stellarium mining operation would require massive infrastructure, and Kelly's companies would build it all. The Modoc Treaty had cost him millions in projected profits, and he wanted revenge as much as he wanted money. Kelly offered to provide equipment and personnel for whatever Stone needed. His construction workers could move through Modoc territory without raising as much suspicion as soldiers would. Lieutenant Karen Price assembled her team with care. She chose soldiers who followed orders without asking questions, and who had flexible morals when it came to dealing with aliens. Price was ambitious and saw this assignment as her chance to prove herself worthy of promotion. Captain Stone had promised her a position on his staff if she handled the operation correctly. She briefed her squad on their mission using vague language about security threats and preemptive measures. The soldiers understood what was really being asked, and none of them objected. Daniel Cooper overheard fragments of conversation that troubled him. He was working late in the colony administration building when voices carried through the ventilation system. Daniel could not make out every word, but he caught enough to know something wrong was being planned. He heard Margaret's name mentioned along with references to the Deadlands and making things look like accidents. Daniel's blood ran cold as he realized they were discussing an attack disguised as a Modoc raid. He tried to record the conversation, but his device malfunctioned at the critical moment. Margaret dismissed Daniel's concerns when he warned her the next morning. She pointed out that Commander Hayes would never allow harm to come to the research team. Daniel argued that Hayes might not know what was being planned, but Margaret had too much faith in the system. She believed that checks and balances would prevent any conspiracy from succeeding. Daniel wanted to push harder, but Margaret had already moved on to discussing their upcoming expedition into the Deadlands. They were scheduled to search for a rare flower that Modoc healers used to treat fevers. Both human and Modoc children had fallen ill recently, and the medicine might save lives. Winema arrived at the outpost with news that made the expedition more urgent. 3 Modoc children had died from the fever in the past 2 days. The healers had used up their supply of the medicine flower and needed more immediately. The flower only grew in the deepest parts of the Deadlands, where few Modoc ventured even in desperate times. Margaret agreed to leave immediately despite Daniel's protests about proper preparation. Winema assured them she knew safe paths through the dangerous terrain. Daniel insisted on coming along with 2 security officers named Helen Morris and Jack Bennett for protection. Captain Stone learned about the expedition within hours. His intelligence network inside the colony was efficient, and someone always reported Margaret's movements. Stone saw the opportunity he had been waiting for. The Deadlands were perfect for what he had planned. The terrain was treacherous and full of natural hazards that could kill someone without any need for weapons. If Margaret died there along with her Modoc friend, then both problems would be solved at once. The incident could be blamed on the dangers of the environment or on Modoc raiders, depending on which story served their purposes better. Lieutenant Price received her orders that evening. She was to take her squad and intercept Margaret's expedition in the Deadlands. They would dress in modified Modoc clothing to confuse any witnesses. The security officers with Margaret would be eliminated first. Margaret herself should appear to have died from natural causes if possible. The Modoc warrior was to be killed in a way that looked like she had attacked the humans first. Price felt a moment of hesitation when she heard the full plan, but her ambition overrode her conscience. She told herself she was following orders from legitimate authority, and that made it acceptable. Patrick Kelly provided equipment that could not be traced back to official military supplies. The squad received weapons that used chemical propellants instead of standard energy signatures. Their clothing was assembled from materials that looked like Modoc leather at a distance. Kelly's people had even created fake Modoc spears and knives based on examples stolen from trading posts. The attention to detail was impressive and disturbing. Stone complimented Kelly on his thoroughness, and the construction boss grinned with pride at his own deviousness. Ambassador Vross reviewed the operation plan and approved it with cold calculation. He added one crucial instruction. If anything went wrong and the conspiracy was exposed, then Stone and Kelly would take full responsibility. Vross would express shock and outrage at their unauthorized actions. He had already prepared documents that would show he had ordered them to protect the research team, not attack it. Vross had survived in galactic politics by always having someone else to blame when plans failed. Stone and Kelly understood the game and accepted their roles. They believed the operation would succeed and the rewards would be worth the risks. Margaret spent her last evening at the colony having dinner with Vincent. They talked about small things and avoided discussing the dangers of the expedition. Vincent held her hand across the table and told her to be careful. Margaret promised she would return safely and kissed him goodbye with genuine affection. She loved her husband even though her work consumed most of her energy and attention. Vincent watched her leave and felt a premonition he could not explain. Something about this expedition felt different and wrong, but he had no logical reason for his worry. Winema prepared for the journey with rituals her mother had taught her. She painted symbols on her spear and spoke prayers to ancestors who watched over Modoc warriors. The Deadlands had claimed many lives over the centuries, and Winema respected the dangers they would face. She thought about Margaret and the strange bond they had formed. Winema had never expected to care about a human, but Margaret had earned her trust through patience and genuine respect. The Modoc warrior would protect her friend with her life if necessary. That promise was about to be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. Daniel packed his equipment with shaking hands. His instincts screamed that they were walking into a trap, but he had no proof and no one who would listen. He checked his sidearm and made sure his emergency beacon was functioning. Helen Morris and Jack Bennett prepared their gear with professional efficiency. They were good soldiers who took their duty seriously. None of them knew that Lieutenant Price's squad was already moving into position along their planned route. The conspiracy was in motion and events were rushing toward a collision that would change everything for everyone involved on Tula Prime. The expedition left before dawn when the wetlands were still wrapped in fog. Winema led them along paths that seemed to appear and disappear with each step. Margaret followed close behind while Daniel and the two security officers struggled to keep pace. The Modoc warrior moved with absolute confidence through terrain that looked identical in every direction. She read signs in the plants and soil that were invisible to human eyes. Margaret tried to memorize the route but quickly realized she would be hopelessly lost without Winema's guidance. The Deadlands began where the normal wetlands ended. The transition was subtle at first, but Margaret felt the change in atmosphere. The air grew thicker and carried smells of decay and strange minerals. Plants here had twisted shapes and colors that seemed wrong compared to normal vegetation. Winema explained that the ground in this region was unstable and had swallowed whole hunting parties in the past. Only the most experienced Modoc ventured here, and even they moved with extreme caution. Margaret's scientific mind cataloged the unique ecosystem, while her survival instincts screamed warnings. Helen Morris checked her weapon for the third time that morning. Something about this mission felt off to her. Jack Bennett shared her unease, but neither of them could identify what was wrong. Daniel walked between them and the main group with his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. His military training from years ago had kicked in automatically. He noticed things that did not fit the natural pattern. Broken branches that showed tool marks rather than animal damage. Footprints that were too regular to be from random Modoc hunters. Someone was out here and trying to stay hidden. Lieutenant Price watched the expedition through enhanced optics from a concealed position. Her squad had arrived hours earlier and set up ambush points along Winema's likely path. Price had studied Modoc movement patterns and predicted their route with reasonable accuracy. She gave hand signals to her team and they moved into final positions. Each soldier carried enough firepower to eliminate the targets quickly. Price felt her heartbeat accelerate with anticipation. This was her moment to prove herself and earn the promotion Captain Stone had promised. Winema stopped suddenly and raised her hand for silence. Margaret froze while Daniel brought his weapon up to ready position. Helen and Jack spread out to cover different angles. The forest around them had gone completely silent. No birds called and no insects buzzed. Winima's skin pattern shifted to colors that Margaret had learned meant danger. The Modoc warrior's enhanced senses detected threats that humans could not perceive. She smelled gun oil and human sweat from the wrong direction. Someone was hunting them and had made the mistake of getting upwind. The ambush erupted with shocking violence. Helen Morris died instantly when multiple rounds tore through her chest. Jack Bennett managed to return fire before taking hits that dropped him to the ground. Daniel threw himself behind a fallen log and started shooting at muzzle flashes he could barely see through the fog. Margaret screamed and ran without thinking in the only direction that seemed safe. Winema roared with fury and charged toward the attackers with her spear ready. The Modoc warrior moved faster than human eyes could track. Lieutenant Price cursed when she saw her carefully planned ambush falling apart. The Modoc had reacted too quickly and was already among her soldiers. Price heard screams as Winema's spear found targets with lethal precision. One soldier went down with the spear through his throat. Another fell when Winema broke his neck with her bare hands. The Modoc warrior fought with a ferocity that terrified the remaining squad members. They had been told this would be a simple elimination of unarmed researchers. No one had warned them they would face a Modoc warrior in full combat mode. Daniel shot blindly through the fog and felt his weapon jam after 3 rounds. He worked the action desperately while bullets chewed the log he hid behind into splinters. 1 round grazed his shoulder and sent burning pain down his arm. Daniel saw Margaret disappearing into the deeper parts of the Deadlands and wanted to follow, but he was pinned down. He pulled his emergency beacon and activated it, knowing the signal would bring help eventually. Whether eventually would be soon enough was another question. He fired 2 more shots before his weapon jammed again permanently. Margaret ran through the fog with branches tearing at her clothes and face. She could hear gunfire behind her mixed with inhuman screams that might have been Winema or her attackers. Margaret's scientific training was useless now. She was operating on pure adrenaline and instinct. The ground beneath her feet changed texture, and she stumbled forward onto what looked like solid earth. Her leading foot broke through a thin crust and sank into something that felt like thick mud. Margaret tried to pull back, but her momentum carried her forward. Both legs plunged into the gray muck, and she realized with horror that she had found quicksand. Winema killed a 3rd attacker and wounded 2 others before the squad broke and ran. Lieutenant Price screamed at them to hold position, but her soldiers had lost their nerve. They crashed through the underbrush, heading back toward their extraction point. Price fired a few more shots at the Modoc warrior before retreating herself. She had failed the mission and now had to figure out how to explain the disaster to Captain Stone. Price did not notice Daniel lying wounded behind his log, or she might have finished him too. Eliminate a witness. The forest went silent again, except for Margaret's gasping breaths. She had managed to stop running, but the damage was done. The quicksand held her legs in an implacable grip. Margaret tried to remember emergency procedures for quicksand from her survival training years ago. Spread your weight. Do not struggle. Wait for rescue. She attempted to lean backward and distribute her body across more surface area, but her backpack threw off her balance. Margaret felt herself sinking deeper with each small movement. The gray mud was now up to her thighs and rising slowly but steadily. Winema appeared through the fog like an avenging spirit. Her clothing was torn and splattered with blood that was not her own. The Modoc warrior still carried her spear, and her eyes blazed with fury that slowly faded when she saw Margaret's predicament. Winema skidded to a stop at the edge of the quicksand field and assessed the situation with the calm that came from years of training and survival. She spoke quickly in Modoc, telling Margaret to stay still and not panic. Margaret understood the words, but panic was already rising in her chest like a living thing. The quicksand field stretched 20 meters across between them. Winema could not simply wade in and pull Margaret out without both of them being swallowed. The Modoc warrior looked around desperately for materials she could use. She found a dead tree trunk lying nearby and began dragging it toward the quicksand's edge. The trunk was heavy, but Winema's strength made the task possible. She positioned it carefully to create a bridge that would distribute her weight across a larger area. Margaret watched with hope warring against terror as her friend worked with incredible speed. Daniel managed to bind his wounded shoulder and stumbled toward where he had last seen Margaret. He found the scene of Winema's battle first. 3 bodies lay in pools of blood. Helen and Jack were beyond help. Daniel said a quick prayer for them and kept moving. He heard Winema's voice calling out instructions in Modoc and followed the sound. Daniel emerged at the quicksand field and saw Margaret chest deep in the gray mud, with Winema crawling across a makeshift bridge toward her. He started forward to help, but Winema snarled at him to stay back. Adding more weight would collapse the bridge. Margaret felt the quicksand compress her chest and make breathing difficult. The pendant Winema had given her pressed against her sternum like a talisman. Margaret focused on that small pressure point and used it to center herself. She stopped struggling and forced her breathing to slow. Winema was coming, and Winema would save her. Margaret had to believe that because the alternative was drowning in gray mud far from home. She thought about Vincent and wished she had told him that morning how much she loved him. She thought about all the research still undone, and the bridges still unbuilt between humans and Modoc. Margaret refused to let it end here in the Deadlands, surrounded by senseless violence. Winema crawled across the log bridge with agonizing slowness. Every movement had to be calculated and precise. The dead tree trunk groaned under her weight and began sinking into the quicksand at its far end. Winema spoke continuously in her language, using the calm voice that Modoc mothers use to soothe frightened children. She told Margaret about the time she had fallen through ice as a young girl, and how her grandmother had talked her through the rescue. She told stories about other Modoc who had survived impossible situations through patience and courage. Margaret listened to the melodic words and felt her panic recede slightly. The quicksand had reached Margaret's chest, and each breath required conscious effort. The pressure squeezed her ribs and made her feel like she was being crushed in a vice. Margaret wanted to scream for help, but saved her energy for breathing. She kept her arms spread wide on the surface of the quicksand as Winema had instructed. The position was exhausting, but it slowed her descent. Margaret could see Winema getting closer inch by agonizing inch. The Modoc warrior's face showed absolute determination, mixed with something that looked like fear. Margaret realized that Winema was terrified for her, and that knowledge somehow gave her strength. Daniel watched from the edge of the quicksand field with his useless weapon hanging from one hand. He had never felt so helpless in his life. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the pain seemed distant and unimportant. All that mattered was the drama playing out before him. He saw the log bridge sinking deeper and knew that time was running out. Daniel wanted to do something, but anything he tried might make the situation worse. So he stood and witnessed and prayed to whatever might be listening. Winema reached the end of the log bridge and found herself still 3 meters short of Margaret. The trunk had sunk too deep and would not support her weight if she crawled farther. Winema cursed in her native language, using words that would have scandalized the elders. She backed up slightly to firmer section of the log and began removing her equipment. The leather belt and spear harness came off first. Winema tied them together to create a makeshift rope. The leather was strong, but the rope was barely long enough to bridge the gap. It would have to be enough because there were no other options. Margaret watched Winema create the rope and understood what her friend intended. The quicksand was now pressing against her armpits. Margaret estimated she had perhaps 5 minutes before it covered her mouth and nose. 5 minutes to live or die based on whether Winema could pull her free from the suction that held her like concrete. Margaret thought about the irony of traveling across light years of space only to die in mud on an alien world. She thought about how her last major act had been to prevent violence between species, only to fall victim to violence anyway. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. Winema threw the leather rope and Margaret caught it on the second try. The Modoc warrior braced herself on the log and began to pull with steady pressure. Margaret felt the rope tighten around her hands and then felt the awful resistance of the quicksand refusing to release her. Winema pulled harder, and Margaret screamed as the pressure on her chest became unbearable. The quicksand was like a living thing that wanted to keep its prey. Winema's muscles stood out like cables under her skin as she hauled on the leather rope. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool morning air. The log bridge cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Winema adjusted her position without releasing the rope. She planted her feet more firmly and pulled with everything she had. Margaret felt herself rise perhaps an inch before the suction reasserted itself. The quicksand made obscene sucking sounds as it tried to pull her back down. Margaret's ribs felt like they were being crushed and black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She was going to pass out and then she was going to die, and Winema would have risked her life for nothing. Winema saw Margaret's eyes starting to glaze and knew she was losing consciousness. The Modoc warrior released a roar that echoed across the Deadlands. It was a sound of pure defiance against death and fate and the uncaring universe. Winema pulled with strength that should have been impossible even for her species. Muscles tore and tendons strained past their limits. The leather rope creaked but held. Margaret felt herself rising again, and this time the movement continued. The quicksand released its suction with a sound like a giant gasping for breath. Margaret came free all at once, and the sudden release sent both women sprawling. Winema fell backward on the log bridge with Margaret's weight pulling her off balance. They slid toward the edge of solid ground in a tangle of limbs and rope. Daniel rushed forward and grabbed Winema's leg before she could slide into the quicksand herself. His wounded shoulder screamed in protest, but he held on with desperate strength. The three of them ended up in a heap on solid ground, covered in gray mud and gasping for air. Margaret lay still for a long moment while her lungs remembered how to work properly. The pressure was gone, and breathing felt like the most wonderful thing in the world. She became aware of Winema's arms around her and realized the Modoc warrior was trembling. Margaret had never seen Winema show such vulnerability. She reached up and touched her friend's face and felt wetness that might have been tears or sweat or both. Margaret spoke in broken Modoc, telling Winema that she was safe now, and thanking her for the rescue. Winema replied with words that Margaret did not fully understand, but the meaning was clear. They were sisters now, bound by shared survival. Daniel helped them both sit up and checked Margaret for injuries. She had bruises on her chest and arms, but nothing seemed broken. The quicksand had left a gray coating on her skin and clothing that would probably never wash out completely. Daniel's emergency beacon was still transmitting, and he estimated that rescue teams would arrive within an hour. They needed to move away from the quicksand field and find defensible ground in case Lieutenant Price's squad returned. Daniel was pretty sure the attackers had run away, but he was not taking chances. Winema retrieved her spear and what remained of her equipment. The leather rope had stretched beyond usability, but she kept it anyway as a reminder of what they had survived. The Modoc warrior's hands were bleeding where the rope had torn her skin during the rescue. She ignored the injuries and focused on getting her companions to safety. Winema led them to a rocky outcrop that offered good visibility and some protection. They settled in to wait for rescue while the sun climbed higher and burned away the morning fog. Margaret removed the pendant from around her neck and looked at it closely for the first time since Winema had given it to her. The carved symbols seemed to glow with inner light, though that was probably just her imagination. She had read about these pendants in her research, but had not fully understood their significance. Now she knew in her bones what the symbols meant. They spoke of bonds that could not be broken by distance or danger or even death. Margaret placed the pendant back around her neck and felt its weight settle against her heart like a promise. Winema sat beside Margaret and began treating her own wounded hands with supplies from Daniel's medical kit. The Modoc warrior worked with practiced efficiency despite the pain. She had been injured many times during training and hunts, but this felt different. These wounds had been earned, saving a life that mattered more to Winema than she had realized. The young Modoc had grown up believing that humans were invaders who would eventually destroy her people. Margaret had proven that belief wrong through years of patient respect and genuine friendship. Now Winema would defend that friendship against anyone who threatened it, including her own people if necessary. Daniel watched the two women sitting together and understood that he was witnessing something that would change the future of Tula Prime. The bond between Margaret and Winema had been tested in the most extreme way possible and had emerged stronger than before. When news of this rescue spread, it would force both humans and Modoc to reconsider their assumptions about each other. Daniel made a mental note to document everything that had happened here. This story needed to be told truthfully and completely so that others could learn from it. The rescue shuttles arrived with Commander Hayes personally leading the response team. Vincent jumped from the craft before it fully landed and ran toward Margaret with his medical scanner already active. He swept the device over her body, checking for internal injuries while his hands shook with relief at finding her alive. Margaret tried to explain what had happened, but Vincent just held her close and told her the explanations could wait. Daniel gave a brief report about the ambush and the quicksand rescue while medics treated his shoulder wound and Winema's torn hands. Hayes listened to Daniel's account with growing fury. His face went through several shades of red before settling on a pale anger that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. He immediately ordered a security lockdown of the colony and demanded that Captain Stone report to him immediately. Hayes had trusted the military man to protect his people, and instead Stone had apparently sent assassins. The commander pulled Daniel aside and asked him to repeat everything he had overheard in the administration building. Daniel recounted the fragments of conversation about making things look like accidents and removing obstacles to progress. Winema refused medical evacuation and insisted on returning to her people on foot. She needed to report what had happened to Chief Kinpuash before rumors spread. Margaret wanted to go with her, but Vincent absolutely forbade it. Margaret had nearly died and needed proper medical evaluation even if she felt fine. Winema understood and promised to return to the colony once she had spoken with her father. The two women embraced briefly before Winema disappeared into the forest, moving with the fluid grace that made her seem like part of the landscape itself. The bodies of Helen Morris and Jack Bennett were recovered along with 3 dead attackers. Hayes ordered forensic teams to process everything at the ambush site. The dead attackers wore modified clothing that looked like Modoc leather, but forensics quickly identified the materials as human manufacture. Weapon residue on their hands matched firearms rather than Modoc spears. Most damning were the military-issue boots that someone had forgotten to replace with native footwear. The evidence made it clear that humans had staged a fake Modoc attack. Captain Stone was arrested attempting to board an outbound transport. He had packed in a hurry and left behind documents that connected him directly to the conspiracy. Hayes found detailed plans for the ambush, including maps and photographs of Margaret's usual routes. There were also financial records showing payments from Patrick Kelly's companies to Stone's personal accounts. The captain maintained his innocence for approximately 10 minutes before his lawyer advised him to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Stone started naming names and providing details about how Ambassador Vross had orchestrated everything. Patrick Kelly was found in his office attempting to destroy computer records. Colony security seized his systems before he could complete the data wipe. Forensic technicians recovered communications between Kelly and Stone, discussing the best ways to eliminate Margaret and Winema. Kelly had even provided suggestions about making deaths look natural by using the Deadlands environment. He had researched Quicksand locations and recommended them as ideal disposal sites. Reading those messages made Hayes feel physically ill. These men had planned murder with the casual efficiency of planning a construction project. Ambassador Vross maintained his composure when Hayes confronted him. The ambassador produced documents showing he had ordered Stone to protect the research team, not attack them. He expressed shock and dismay at his subordinate's actions. Vross played the role of betrayed superior officer perfectly. Hayes did not believe a word of it, but proving Vross had given illegal orders would be difficult. The ambassador had been careful to leave no direct evidence linking him to the conspiracy. He had used verbal orders and intermediaries to maintain deniability. Margaret was released from medical after extensive testing showed only bruising and mild shock. She went directly to the administration building and demanded access to all records related to the attack. Hayes granted her request and assigned Daniel to assist with the investigation. They spent hours reviewing communications and financial records looking for the connection to Vross. Margaret approached it like a research project using the same methodical analysis she applied to studying Modoc culture. Daniel provided the investigative experience from his previous career in military intelligence. Chief Kinpuash arrived at the colony with 20 armed warriors the next morning. Winema had reported the attack and the Modoc were ready for war. The old chief demanded to speak with Hayes and Vross immediately. He wanted explanations and justice for the attempt on his daughter's life. Hayes met him in the council chamber and laid out all the evidence they had gathered. He made it clear that the conspiracy was the work of individuals, not official human policy. Kinpuash listened without expression while his warriors stood ready behind him. Winema stood at her father's side and added her own testimony. She described the ambush and the fake Modoc clothing the attackers wore. She explained how the Quicksand had nearly claimed Margaret, and how they had survived through cooperation and trust. Kinpuash looked at his daughter with new understanding. Winema had risked her life for a human, and had formed bonds that transcended species. The old chief recognized that his daughter represented the future, while he represented the past. The question was whether that future would be built on cooperation or soaked in blood. Ambassador Vross attended the meeting and continued his performance of outraged innocence. He promised the Galactic Council would conduct a full investigation and prosecute anyone involved in unauthorized military actions. Kinpuash stared at the ambassador with eyes that had seen 6 decades of life. The Modoc chief might not understand human technology, but he understood when someone was lying. Vross's words were smooth and practiced, but they carried no weight of truth. Kinpuash spoke in his own language with Winema translating. He said that actions mattered more than words and that humans would be judged by what they did next. Margaret entered the chamber still wearing clothes stained with gray quicksand mud. She had not bothered to change because she wanted everyone to see the evidence of what she had survived. Margaret placed herself between Quintpuash and Vros and spoke in formal Modoc protocol. She acknowledged the attack and asked for the Modoc's patience while the investigation continued. She vouched personally for Commander Hayes's integrity and his commitment to justice. Margaret removed Winema's pendant from around her neck and held it up for all to see. She explained its meaning and significance to demonstrate the depth of her bond with the Modoc people. Winema stepped forward and took the pendant from Margaret's hands. The young warrior spoke firmly in both languages. She said that Margaret had earned the right to wear the pendant through courage and trust. She described the Quicksand rescue in detail, emphasizing how Margaret had remained calm and followed instructions even when death seemed certain. Winema explained that such courage was worthy of honor in Modoc culture regardless of species. She placed the pendant back around Margaret's neck, and the gesture spoke louder than any words could. Chief Quintpuash made his decision. The Modoc would not go to war immediately, but they would watch closely. If justice was served and the guilty were punished, then peace could continue. If humans protected their own and let crimes go unpunished, then the treaty would be void. The old chief set a deadline of 1 week for Hayes to provide concrete results. Quintpuash and his warriors departed with Winema remaining behind to serve as observer and to protect Margaret from any further attacks. Daniel and Margaret returned to their investigation with renewed urgency. They knew Vros had been involved, but proving it required finding the connection between his orders and Stone's actions. Margaret applied her research skills to analyzing communication patterns and behavioral linguistics. She noticed that certain phrases in Vros's official messages matched phrases in Stone's planning documents. The connection was subtle, but it established that they were coordinating even when using separate communication channels. Vincent watched his wife work through the night and felt proud, mixed with worry. Margaret had always been driven, but now she carried the weight of preventing a war. He brought her food and coffee and reminded her to rest. Margaret smiled at him with exhaustion clear in her eyes. She told him this was more important than sleep. Vincent understood and sat beside her, offering silent support. He had married a scientist, but somewhere along the way she had become something more. Margaret was now a bridge between worlds, and the fate of Tula Prime rested on her shoulders. The story of Winema's rescue spread across human space faster than anyone expected. Media outlets picked up the account and turned it into a sensation that captured public imagination. The image of a supposedly primitive alien risking her life to save a human scientist challenged comfortable assumptions about technological superiority and cultural development. News programs ran interviews with Margaret and Winema, discussing their friendship and the bonds that had formed between their peoples. The interviews were translated into dozens of languages and broadcast across hundreds of worlds. Human public opinion shifted dramatically regarding treatment of indigenous species. Advocacy groups used Winema's story to argue for stronger protections and equal partnership rather than exploitation. Politicians who had supported aggressive expansion policies found themselves facing difficult questions about what humanity stood for among the stars. The Galactic Council faced pressure to review its policies toward species that lacked advanced technology. Winema became an unlikely celebrity and symbol of dignity for all peoples regardless of their development level. Chief Quintpuash negotiated the new mining treaty from a position of unexpected strength. The publicity around the rescue attempt had made the Modoc sympathetic figures, and the Council could not afford to appear oppressive. The new treaty gave Modoc equal partnership in mining operations, with profits split evenly between human corporations and Modoc communities. The treaty also established protected zones where no mining could occur and gave Modoc final authority over land use decisions. It was far more than Quintpuash had hoped for when negotiations began. Daniel Cooper completed his academic paper on Modoc culture and submitted it to the most prestigious xenoanthropology journal in human space. The paper argued that technological advancement was only one measure of civilization and not necessarily the most important one. Daniel used Modoc social structures and survival skills to demonstrate sophisticated thinking that equaled or exceeded human capabilities in different domains. His work cited Winema's rescue as proof that courage and loyalty transcended species boundaries. The paper was accepted for publication and became required reading in xenology programs across human universities. Margaret and Winema established the Tula Prime Institute for Interspecies Studies. The institute brought together human scientists and Modoc teachers to study each other's cultures in collaborative research. Students from both species attended classes side by side, learning about biology and physics alongside tracking and wilderness medicine. The institute became a model for similar programs on other worlds where humans encountered indigenous populations. Applications flooded in from young people eager to be part of building a different kind of future. Vincent Hayes accepted a promotion to regional administrator, overseeing multiple colony worlds. The position would require him to travel frequently and spend time away from Tula Prime. Margaret supported his decision even though it meant less time together. Their relationship had evolved into something built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than daily proximity. Vincent understood that Margaret belonged to something larger than their marriage, and he had made peace with that reality. They loved each other deeply, but their love no longer demanded traditional boundaries. Winema moved between her people's villages and the human colony with growing ease. She maintained her identity as a Modoc warrior, while adopting aspects of human culture that made sense to her. Winema wore traditional leathers during ceremonies, but also wore human clothing when working at the institute. She carried her ancestral spear alongside a human medical kit. The young warrior embodied the synthesis of cultures that both species were beginning to achieve. Other Modoc watched her example and began their own experiments with combining traditions. The first group of sick children were cured using the medicine, flowers that Margaret and Winema had originally sought in the Deadlands. The flowers were successfully cultivated in controlled environments, making the medicine widely available. Both human and Modoc children who had been dying recovered fully. The success demonstrated the practical benefits of cooperation beyond abstract ideals about peace. Parents from both species had reason to be grateful that Margaret and Winema had survived their ordeal and completed their mission. Margaret returned to the Quicksand field 1 year after nearly dying there. She came alone this time, wanting to face the place without witnesses. The gray mud looked exactly as she remembered, and the fear came flooding back. Margaret stood at the edge and let herself feel the terror she had suppressed during the rescue. She remembered the pressure on her chest and the certainty that she was going to die. She remembered Winema's face above her, full of determination and fear and love. The memory was both terrifying and precious. Winema found Margaret at the Quicksand field an hour later. The Modoc warrior had followed her friend, knowing that Margaret needed to make this journey. They stood together in silence, watching the morning fog swirl over the deadly surface. Winema finally spoke in her language, saying that the earth tests people to reveal their true nature. Margaret had been tested and proven worthy of the pendant she wore. Winema had been tested and proven that courage meant risking everything for those you love. They had both emerged from the Quicksand stronger than before. Margaret asked Winema what the Modoc word for sister meant at its deepest level. Winema explained that it meant someone who shares your breath and your life. Sisters in Modoc culture were bound by obligations that superseded even family loyalty. They protected each other and carried each other's burdens and celebrated each other's joys. The bond between sisters could not be broken by distance or disagreement or even death. Winema said that Margaret was her sister in the truest sense, and nothing would change that. The Modoc philosophy that Winema shared that day became central to Margaret's understanding of what they were, building on Tula Prime. The planet was not about humans, civilizing primitives, or about Modoc maintaining isolation. It was about two species learning to share breath and life across the boundaries that should have kept them apart. The Quicksand had been a test that revealed the possibility of genuine connection. Everything that followed was an attempt to build on that foundation. Daniel watched from a distance as Margaret and Winema stood together at the Quicksand field. He had come to document the first anniversary of the rescue for the Institute archives. Daniel had long since accepted that his feelings for Margaret would never be returned. But he had found purpose in preserving the story of what she and Winema had accomplished. His work would ensure that future generations understood how cooperation had been born from crisis. Daniel's camera captured images of two figures standing side by side with their shadows, merging in the morning light. Commander Hayes retired from military service 5 years after the conspiracy had been exposed. He had spent those years working to ensure that Tula Prime remained a model of species cooperation. Hayes established policies and procedures that other colonies adopted. He trained a generation of administrators who understood that indigenous peoples were partners, not obstacles. On his last day, Hayes met with Chief Kintpwash, who was now very old and nearing the end of his life. The two leaders shared a meal and reflected on how far their peoples had come. Chief Kintpwash died peacefully surrounded by his family and friends. Both humans and Modoc mourned the passing of a leader who had chosen wisdom over war. Winema inherited her father's position, though the title was modified to acknowledge her unique role bridging two cultures. She became Chief Winema and expanded her responsibilities to include diplomatic relations with human colonies across the region. The young woman who had once pulled her friend from Quicksand became a statesman whose influence extended far beyond Tula Prime. Margaret continued her research and teaching until age forced her to slow down. She trained dozens of xenoanthropologists who carried her methods to other worlds. Margaret's greatest pride was watching her students build relationships with alien species based on respect rather than exploitation. She had proven that humanity's strength lay not in weapons or technology, but in the capacity to recognize worth in others. The pendant Winema had given her remained around her neck until the day she died. It was buried with her according to Modoc custom for honored dead. The final scene of their story took place at Margaret's funeral. Humans and Modoc gathered together to honor the woman who had bridged their worlds. Winema spoke about their friendship and about the moment in the quicksand when everything had changed. She described how Margaret had remained calm and trusted her completely. That trust had allowed Winema to attempt an impossible rescue. The bond they formed in that moment had grown to encompass two entire species. Winema said that Margaret's legacy was proof that love and courage could overcome any obstacle. Vincent Hayes placed flowers on his wife's grave and felt at peace despite his grief. Margaret had lived the life she chose and changed the galaxy in ways that would echo for generations. Their marriage had been unconventional, but it had been built on genuine love and respect. Vincent had supported Margaret's work even when it took her away from him, because he understood that she belonged to something greater.